In the 1980s, a young Icelandic scholar, Gísli Sigurðsson, came to Ireland to take his MPhil at UCD. Gísli was fascinated by the Icelandic Sagas and by the question, why did Iceland become the author of the Viking Age? And did it have anything to do with its links to Ireland, a country known for its monastic manuscripts and bardic tradition? So Gísli's thesis in 1988 on the Gaelic influences in the sagas created a few ripples amongst his fellow folklorists. For some time, he was seen as a bit of an outrider, making the case for Gaelic echoes and motifs in the sagas, and seeing the parallels with Irish myths like Cuchulainn. So some of his colleagues dismissed it, thinking he overplayed those influences and that the Icelandic culture was solely Norwegian and Viking in origin. But today, the genetic studies showing over 60% of the women and some 20% of the men were Gaelic, mostly slaves, has more than supported Gísli's thesis. So Linda Buckley and I met up with Gísli Sigurðsson, who's now a research professor at the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies at the University of Iceland, to find out a bit more about what made Gísli swim against that tide and why the slave origin story is a bit tricky for both Iceland and Ireland to explore and accept.
Yeah, I'm Gísli Sigurðsson. I work here as a research professor at the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies, which is attached to the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. And I began my university studies here in the same building, in Icelandic Studies as it was called, and was soon drawn to the old and medieval literature of Iceland, and in particular the question of origins and how it came about that Iceland was the only country within the Scandinavian family of nations to produce this wealth of literary material, prose, narratives and poetry, and monopolizing the professional court market in Scandinavia as well, all through the late Viking Age and early Middle Ages, and down to the time of writing of these texts in the 13th century. And one of the ideas that had come up in the scholarship already in the 19th century was that this was because of the Gaelic contribution to the culture of Iceland, and we know that the professional status of poetry and storytelling was much higher in the Irish culture than we know of in the Germanic speaking countries. But the current thinking in the 1970s and the early 80s, when I was doing my studies, was that this had really not caught on, this had not been proven, and there was very little evidence to substantiate this idea, and this should rather be explained with notions about Iceland being far away and isolated and having developed some peculiar culture because of the shock effect of the settlement uprooting phenomenon from an old country, settling in a new area, making memories of both that new beginning and the past in the other world. I found rather unsatisfactory, and so I went and did my master's after the BA in Icelandic and comparative literature in Dublin, doing Old Irish and sort of medieval studies. I postulated that there was a pattern developing, that there were individual motifs from the Irish context to be detected in the oldest story material that we had in the Icelandic Sagas, or the stories about the Viking Age. And then in individual family sagas, that is, sagas that are set within Iceland, beginning with the settlement, the first people who come and give names to the land, and events and stories start to develop in a previously unsettled territory. The stories that were set in the landscape where there was also a memory of settlers coming from the Gaelic world, so either in Scotland or in Ireland, these sagas had more of these Gaelic-like or Old Irish-like motifs than texts from other areas where there was no memory of people from that part of the world being among the first settlers, rather where people were coming directly from Norway. And one of the most fascinating ideas that had come up already in the 19th century was that this was due to the Gaelic cultural contacts with the Norse world during the Viking Age in the 9th and 10th centuries, and that this had in particular been important for the development of what happened in Iceland. There are many problems with that idea. First, the contacts are in the 9th and 10th century. The literature we have is from the 12th and 13th. And people were not too happy with this idea either. This was at the time of nationalism, that people liked the notion of clear and pure cultures. So the Germanic and the Norse culture was one thing, and the Irish and Gaelic was another, and you shouldn't mix the two. And even the Germanic aspect of it was that they wanted to have the Ur-Germanic culture preserved in Iceland, and there was no place for any infusion from the Gaelic world in that idea, which was later, of course, abused and developed within the Nazi period, and with very sad stories attached to that. No one really liked the idea at the time that there had been a substantial role played by the Gaelic population in early Iceland. So the idea that I grew up with was that this was mostly a Norse colony, and with a few perhaps Irish slaves, but not many and not important. And this was again formulated at a time when social status was important, national Puritanism was important. So the self-image or the identity of the Icelandic intellectuals was that they were all descendants from Norse male chieftains, and there was not even any place for women in that past. So it's there are all kinds of ideological issues in the way we see the past. In the old school of thinking, people just saw males in the past, and of course males of superior social status, and now we have realized that that's not how societies are structured, and we have managed to break out of that way of thinking.
And that brings us very nicely to the story of Melkorka and kind of strong female characters within the Laxdæla saga. And maybe could you tell us a little bit about that and the role of women throughout that saga?
In the sagas, and in the Laxdæla saga with Melkorka in particular, there's great obsession with social status. And so if you are of high-born, or you can trace your family to someone of that is supposedly high-born earl, king, or phenomenal character in the world of stories, then that somehow gives you some platform to stand on as well in your own cultural environment. And mostly the slaves that come into the stories, they are anonymous, and they don't have any families, because partly the sagas, they are about your ancestors and your pride that you take in your ancestry. So you want your ancestors to be of the best possible family, and so on. And the reason we have Melkorka both named with this Irish name is that she is a princess. She's the daughter of a king of Ireland, and so it's acceptable to remember her as an individual, not just as an anonymous slave woman. But in spite of that, or her offsprings have difficulties in getting accepted by the Norse elite among their neighbors, because your mother was enslaved, even though she was born elsewhere. The act of enslavement just somehow spoils your reputation in this culture. And so the saga problematizes this, and the sympathy in the text is with Melkorka and her son and so on. So I think the text somehow works against this supposedly admitted way of thinking. And then we can also take the question of historicity into this. Is this real, or is this just symbolical for so pars pro toto? Because that we can also see in another slave story from Egil's saga, where the character Þorgerður Brák, and she is silenced with the ultimate drowning. Her master, so she swims after saving the life of the son and main character of the saga from the fury of his father. She runs for her life and swims away from shore, and the mad master throws a rock after her that hits her and drowns her. So it's the ultimate silencing of not only the slave voice, but of the female voice, which is transformed into the young male poet who then grows up and practices the art of poetry that he probably learned from his nanny from the Gaelic world. And with Melkorka we also know that the names that are given for the characters that are mentioned in Ireland and so on, they have a semi-match in Ireland. And there is clearly a historical awareness of what we can call a historical reality, even though it's very easy for historians to say that, well, the details don't really match up. So it's always a combination of fact and fiction and wishful thinking, silencing and promoting ideas that you need for the present.
And in your research as well, you talk a lot about recurring motifs that connect between perhaps Irish stories and Icelandic, things like rebirth or connected to the story of Cuchulainn, this kind of thing. What recurring motifs do you feel are most prominent and that connect between the two?
There are several ones attached to the Cuchulainn story that seems to be, they are reshaped and retold in a completely Icelandic setting, in a saga that is set here just north of Reykjavik in the landscape there, with the main character nicknamed Dog, which is of course the meaning of Ku in the Cuchulainn, Dog of Cuchulainn, and rather than being Ku, his name is Búi. So there's also the name rhymes, or the names rhyme, Ku and Bú. And then the details of the story of this Icelandic character, they have the boyhood deeds of Cuchulainn, and they have the stay across the sea in Norway as opposed to Scotland, where he is brought up by knowledgeable women of superior strength that enable him with magical powers and so on. And then ultimately he also fights in a duel with his son, exactly in a similar manner as Cuchulainn does in his story. So there's many different parallels, but if you wouldn't know that there is an Irish story with all the same details, the saga is perfectly Icelandic. There's nothing Irish about it, except that there's a mention of people coming from Ireland into the story, and it's placed in time relative to events in Ireland. But there's a sense of identifying with the medieval past in Iceland, which is fairly easy. The language has not changed that much, so we still claim that we are reading the original texts in the language we still speak. There's not a question of Old Irish being very different from modern Irish, not to mention that Irish is becoming a difficult language in Ireland for the Irish themselves. So we can easily identify with the language of the texts from written in the 12th and 13th century that are less alien than the Shakespearean English is to English speakers of today. And the family line of these characters that is traced from the first settlers that trace their family back to both Ireland and Norway, and even back to the gods, the Norse pagan gods. They continue down to the present, so we still have a sort of relatively solid information about how we can get back to the 12th and 13th centuries, and perhaps it gets a bit more dubious when we start elevating the family tree up to the mythological level. So of course it's meaningless from a genetic point point of view, because you have so many ancestors when it's back in the 30th generation or whatever it is. So the people of Iceland, they are in a sense aboriginals in this country, because there's no earlier culture that has cultivated the land. We have so reasonably living memory still among the current population of the absolute beginning of human habitation. So when all the first place names were given, where the first farms were built, and who built them, and where they came from, and what their name was, and who their descendants were. And I think just living in with that sense of absolute beginning is unique in the world. You don't have a culture of that kind anywhere else. So.
And then the results of your thesis were very much confirmed by research in genetics. Like, how did that feel to know that that really was a very concrete, tangible reality?
Yeah, that was like I told you so feeling, because when I came with my book that was published in 1988, it was a very unpopular idea. And historians here that are so well retiring or recently retired, they are still in a state of denial against these genetic studies from the 90s and early 2000s that demonstrate that a large proportion of the population was actually with Irish and Scottish genetic background. In addition to all the Norsemen who had grown up in the mixed cultural Norse colonies in Ireland and the Isles, and that then emigrated second or third generation to Iceland. So they would not have been with a living memory of anything directly from Norway, but rather from this new culture that they were growing up with in the Isles and Ireland. So this is a massive cultural input coming from a very different part of the world from Norway. And this has not really been acknowledged in yet in historical studies of Iceland, and I still feel that the whole early history has just to be rewritten and redefined in light of these genetic studies, again as I postulated in the thesis that was just based on the written evidence. But it also often goes unnoticed that if you put the evidence in the Book of Settlement into a pattern that where you allow for so women being about half the population and slaves being more numerous perhaps than are mentioned in the texts and so on, that you put the information into a reasonable social model, not just a model where only males of a high social status are mentioned, as is the case in the text. Then you can, by putting all the information about individuals that is not detailed, so if you argue that all of those who don't get mention about their origins can be of Gaelic origins, then you can go up to about 40% of the population coming from the Gaelic world, which is roughly between 20 and 60 as you have now with the genetic information, which differentiates between the sexes. But this 40% figure just takes the overall population without making that differentiation between males and females. So, because the texts don't really allow for that. It's interesting that you can actually argue for that high percentage, but at the time in '88 I said, well, that is way beyond what we can stand for, so I'll just settle for the circa 20% that was reasonable. And that would be enough also to argue for the cultural input that I was postulating. It's a very sensitive idea still, and it's also sensitive from the Irish perspective, so that they were enslaved, so who wants to have a memory of that? That's something you want to just fade out of your memory. The slave memory is uncomfortable, and we have a situation of silencing in the study of the past also. We have long tradition of silencing women in all historical studies, or turning a blind eye towards them, not seeing them. And a perfect example is, so Melkorka, the only reason she gets attention is because she is a princess. And so she gets mentioned again and again and remembered because of that. Then if you have the addition of sort of a slave and a woman, then you just don't even give her a name. You give her perhaps a Norse name that you can remember, because her name doesn't count. And you silenced her completely, as in the case of the slave woman in Egil's saga, who brings up the great Norse poet Egill, but sacrifices her life in the process, and is silenced by the paternal authority on the farm.
And that's Professor Gísli Sigurðsson, head of the Folklore Department at the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies in Reykjavik. Now, I've added some links to Gísli's research to the podcast text box and to our website, mothersbloodsistersongs.com. And you can also see some video clips of our chat with Gísli on the site. Thanks for listening.